Welcome home. We are WNST. Taos of Baltimore. Baltimore Positive. We're positively into the week after the All-Star game, and that means that Luke Jones comes back. It also means that we have a wide swath of Maryland crab cake tours that are coming your way, including the Maryland Oyster Tour. All of it brought to you by the Maryland Lottery, our friends at Gold Rush Sevens Doublers. I still have a handful of these left. We are going to get back out. We're going to be at Fadley's in a couple of weeks, and then I'm like doing a whole litany of things. Angela also Brooks, who's running for senator, is going to be joining us over at State Fair on August 13th. And then into September, we're going to have an Oyster Tour that's going to be just phenomenal. I've been really working hard on that. So big thanks to our friends at Jiffy Lube Multi-Care for also throwing us out onto the road into the fall when football will begin, as well as our friends at Liberty Pure Solutions. And, no offense to Royal Farms. I'm low on coffee this week. I'm going light. I'm going with Liberty Pure Solutions fresh water in my house in a non-sponsored cup. It's not even orange for my the orange and purple goggles that I'll need. Luke Jones joins us now. He is back from the Wildwood. I've never been to Wildwood. I don't know if I've ever admitted that to you after 17 years or how many years we've been doing this together, where you go off to the beach in July every year with your family. All-Star Game week. I don't think you missed a damn thing last week. A couple of wins against Texas and then on Sunday. But I don't think you missed anything. How was Wildwood? Where's your tan, by the way? You were supposed to be in the sun all week.
I've got a tan. I don't know. I mean, I try to cover, use the SPF 30 on my face and all that. But no, it was a great week and good to get away for a little while. Good to see the Orioles win 2 out of 3 over the weekend as they come off the All-Star break, as you kind of look around the rest of the AL East and even looking at Cleveland in terms of the best team in the AL. Orioles in good shape even after Sunday's loss. But always good to get a little bit of a respite. Obviously, this club was struggling at the end not the end of the first half, because we've long since passed the midway point, but clearly scuffling. They get almost a miracle win against the Yankees to close out going into the All-Star break, and then they come out and get 2 out of 3 from Texas. And we've talked about the Rangers at different points over the last month. Buyers, sellers, are they going to get up off the mat? Houston's back in first place. All of that in the AL West. Meanwhile, the Rangers have were desperate to get off to a good start, and they lose 2 out of 3. So Orioles, look, are they on pace to win 108 games like they were a month ago or whatever it was? No, but they're still in really good shape. We're going to talk a lot about the trade deadline and a lot of conjecture and a lot of who knows what's going to happen, because there hasn't been a ton of activity to this point around baseball, but this is still a team that's in really good shape. And yeah, the pitching, there are question marks once you get past Corbin Burns and Grayson Rodriguez. But as we saw over the weekend, Corbin Burns and Grayson Rodriguez still a pretty good 1-2 punch as the Orioles were able to take 2 out of 3.
All right, they're off to Miami in a couple of days. This trading deadline story is going to be the only story that matters for 9 days, and we're going to do a lot of trade talk. I'm going to call everybody in the sport. I did a lot of that last week as well, and talking to people. And the speculation around how many of the young players are going to be given up. But before I do any trading stuff, talk about the team on the field, talk about what you saw at the end before the break, the All-Star game break, and them, and we'll get to the uniforms. I'm having Todd Radham on too. He's not responsible for those hideous uniforms, but concerns about the team's inexperience, last year's version of experience, where they are with starting pitching, where the bullpen is, and we've been talking about that for 6 months. This Texas series, Miami, then they'll come home this weekend. San Diego in this weekend, another team that's sort of trying to figure out their way always this time of the year after spending a lot of money. I mean, San Diego is probably the worst case scenario of spend a lot of money, don't win anything. And I don't know what Mr. Rubenstein's philosophy is going to be. I'm sure I'll wait to hear him on the Jerry Coleman podcast, and I'll get his philosophy at that point. But the philosophy this week is it has to be different than where John Angelos was. Philosophically, they can win the World Series, which there were very few years you could ever say that. Philosophically, they have the franchise that everyone looks at their farm system and says, why didn't you win the Crochet trade? Why didn't you win trade X or whatever? Because they can win the trade. But then the question is, all right, how are we feeling about what we have? So before we start to talk about trading guys and We know the needs. We know they'd like to improve on Dean Kramer on Sunday. They'd like to have John Means and Bradish back. They'd like to find Bautista again. They'd like to find Cano from last year all over again while avoiding Fuji, right? But how do you feel about what they're putting out there right now? That if no trade happens and they keep Mayo and they keep Norby and they stockpile prospects, I don't think that's going to be the case. But I also think Eli's pretty stingy, and he's seeing these Ortiz things going around. He knows the value of these players, and overpaying next week and still not winning the World Series. See San Diego, see Anaheim last year, Anaheim the last 15 years, right? How do you feel about what they have? How do you feel about the current roster?
Well, I think you have to feel pretty good. I mean, you're talking about a team that won 101 games last year. You're talking about a team that even with their scuffles over the last 3.5, 4 weeks, they're on a 98 win pace. I'll put it this way: if you don't love their current roster, then I'm not sure going out and making one or two trades is putting them over the hump. It's not getting them over the hump. They already have a really good roster. So that's when you're talking about, okay, what can we do to augment? I think as far as how they looked over the last 3 to 4 weeks, I think I'll chalk up a lot of it to the ebbs and flows of a long season. I think this lineup, this offense, while yes, people will talk about it being reliant on the home run, which that's still something that I don't really understand, because at the same time, it's not like you get more runs for manufacturing runs or anything like that, or playing small ball, things like that. I think overall, this is still a lineup you feel really good about. I think the outfield we've talked about a lot in terms of liking to find a little more consistency beyond what Anthony Santander has done in right field. We've talked about it with Mullins. We've talked about it with Cowser. We've talked about it with Hayes. We've talked about it with Kyle Stowers coming and going. We've talked about it with Heston Kjerstad. So as I said to you, and I think this is a talking point that we had, I can't remember when exactly, but it was about the last 2 weeks leading into the All-Star break. I said, I'd like to see the Orioles find their next Jordan Westburg. And what I mean by that is, of all these young players that have made their debut over the last calendar year, so going back to Cowser last July, want to see the next guy that really firmly establishes himself. I mean, Jordan Westburg just got back from the All-Star game, right? A year ago at this time, he was looking fine, but wasn't an established all-star caliber talent. You weren't viewing him that way as a major league player. So, I'd still like to see that. And, in terms of their lineup, in terms of the offense, because I see some people say, well, would they benefit from another bat? And look, sure, you can come up with all these hypothetical scenarios of, a right-handed hitting center fielder, for example, but I still think in terms of any spark, any extra energy, any extra oomph they're going to get in their lineup, I think is going to come most likely to come from, as I mentioned, a little more consistency from the guys I mentioned in the outfield, but more so, Jackson Holliday is going to be back up here at some point. I'm still firmly convinced about that, mainly because Jorge Mateo and Ramon Arias, neither one of them have played to a level where you're saying I want to play them every day. And that's not a surprise, right? It's kind of what we expected. I still think in terms of, certainly not as an outfielder, of course, but in terms of another right-handed bat, I think Coby Mayo, if he's not traded, and that's obviously another discussion for another segment, then I think we're going to see him, because I think that bat is too enticing and has been too good at AAA to not at least get a look at what that looks like, at least against left-handed starters. So I still think there's meat on the bone there. Clearly, they need to be a little more consistent than they've been offensively over the last month, but the numbers still speak for themselves. I think they're still first in the AL and slightly, just a slight, slightly behind the Dodgers in terms of runs per game. You don't play almost 100 games at that level without thinking that this is still a pretty good offense. Is it perfect? No, of course it's not perfect. We've talked about this a lot. Offense is down around baseball, and we've talked about some of the big picture issues and approach and all of that. But this is still a lineup 1 to 9. Okay, you get to the bottom couple spots in the order. It's not ideal necessarily. We're not seeing Cedric Mullins have his 2021 season, for example. But I think you look around baseball, most teams are pretty happy if they have a 1 through 6 or 1 through 7 that are productive, fruitful, pretty consistent. And the Orioles have had that for the most part. So, the pitching side, I don't think you need to hear me repeat what we've talked about over and over and over. And we'll get into it and certainly talk about the Tarek Skubals of the world or the Mason Millers of the world that may or may not be out there. I still think that's a big part of the trade deadline as far as who exactly is really available and going to be available for a reasonable price, because you just said it. I don't think it has anything to do with David Rubenstein or his payroll ideals, idea over what it's going to look like over the next 3 to 5 years. I think Mike Elias is still going to view his prospects, his minor league system as assets and as value, and looking at it in terms of, yes, what can we do to augment right now? And then what it'll look like in terms of the major league roster shaking out over the next few years. He's not going to just look at this with blinders of 2024 and then, oh, well, we'll just figure it out in a couple years. I don't think Mike Elias operates that way. I think that much is evident at this point in time. So
I'd love to know if he's under contract with Rubenstein for the next 3 or 4 years. Like if he's here long term, is he at the end of the first contract, or is he into a contract? And I know they never, we never tell anybody any secret society and all that, but that would really affect the long-term thought of, and we always know what the Ravens, DaCosta has a job for life, right? Like he has had a job for life. Bisciotti, from every account, as the football thing gets going, never wants to hire a head coach, never wants to hire a GM. This country's got to make a decision on a president in a couple of weeks. We do that every couple of years here. In most franchises, in most sports, in most places, a GM that would have these kind of assets would say, not really worried about 26 or 27. I need to get a ring now. We're the best team now. I have the new owner now. I'm at the end of my deal now, whatever the deal is. But I think the Elias thing, managing 26, 27, and 28, and he's paid to do that. There's no, they all are. They all are. They're all paid to look out for 2 or 3 years from now. I think when you go through sports with leadership at any level, whether it's general manager, baseball side, coaching, scouting, in any sport, most people are living on the edge of 1 year, this year, end of my contract. And Mike Elias has to manage this in the way that we've always seen the Ravens, where we would say, oh, you take that second round pick and maybe the kid from Washington isn't the starter in the beginning of the year, but you think about where you're going to be 2 or 3 years from now with an inexpensive player playing. And this is for all the sports, young, cheap guys filling a position and playing like a superstar, playing like $100 million player for a little while, whether it's Gunnar Henderson, whether it's Adley Rutschman, and it was last week for this franchise, or whether it's Corbin Burns getting paid fair but not crazy, and certainly you're not into them for 5 or 6 years, that they have this thing going on. But so much of it for me is where Elias's head is for, am I going to be managing this in 26 and 27, or is it someone else's problem? I'm assuming he thinks he's here until Gunnar Henderson's no longer here. And he'll manage it that way. And if he manages it that way, it's not about money. But it is about, can we win right now? Because ask some of these teams like the Padres that thought they had made it 2 years ago or 3 years ago, or they were there, and the Orioles made the playoffs last year and had the best record. I think there's a lot of high-level decisions here for the next couple of years. When I look at Ortiz and see he's the second best rookie and whatever, I saw some chart this week and saying, can't give too many of those guys up. You can't give too many of those guys up. And 3 years from now, you're paying Rutschman $40 million and Henderson $50 million, and all of a sudden you dealt the catcher away this week, or you dealt Kobe Mayo away, and he's now performing as a 35 home run guy, doing all of those things for another team, and you rented a pitcher that's gone. That's gone 2 years from now. That's cool if you got the system and people are coming through. But there's a lot of questions about all of this for me. If I had a media pass and I had real access to ask about the owner, to ask about the executive staff, to ask about this transition of ownership, and to see what the real strategy is over the long term, because you never knew that with Angelos. I'd like to know the Rubenstein philosophy as I'm up on the trading deadline on a team he owns, a team that's in first place, a team with all these prospects. I'd like to get some sort of philosophical thought, and we'll get it by August 1st. It's going to happen whether the trade happens or not. But this is a massive 10-day period for the future of the franchise in we're going to trade everybody away and try to win. They're not going to do that. Or we're going to make one strategic trade and we're going to go all in on Scooble and we're going to get rid of a couple of real prospects, guys we like or know of, and maybe even a veteran guy, give 3-4 guys up. I'm fascinated because this is where the rubber meets the road in tough times for franchises to make tough decisions, that when you've arrived, the decisions of what you do with your assets, young players, and the decisions of what you do with your money, let alone what happens on the field, let alone that Jordan Westburg and Adley Rutschman and Gunnar Henderson are healthy and performing. That's the only way they're going to win a World Series. But this is a really telling 10 days in Oriole history for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely has the potential to be that. I'm glad you just made the last point, though, about what's going to happen on the field. And that's where when I hear someone make comments about, well, you're all in, or this is the year you're going for it, and all that. And I know what people mean by that, and I understand that sentiment. I mean, my goodness, how many times have I quipped and joked with you that you just have to see the gray hair on my temples to remember how long it's been since the Orioles have been in a World Series, as I was born 2 weeks before the Scott McGregor pitched a shutout in Game 5 in Philadelphia. But
you say all in. I don't know how. I don't know
but
what
that's
all in would even look like next week in a trading day. I don't.
right.
All in is, oh my God, they traded half their system away. I don't really want them to do that.
And right, and that doesn't guarantee you anything. We a lot of times, and I understand what people mean by this, but we have to remember, when you look at how baseball, the postseason is structured, especially now, where you're talking about these best of 3 wild card series, best of 5 division, LDS.
You're giving every advantage to the 88 win team.
It is right. So how do you navigate that as a team that won 101 games last year, or the Orioles, who are still, as we're going into this Miami series, best team in the AL, still on track to be the number 1 seed, or at least a top 2 seed? How do you navigate that? So from the standpoint of, all right, looking at it, and look, I'm not saying that this is gospel in terms of how the odds and playoffs and World Series odds and chances go, but looking at Baseball Reference, as of Monday morning, after this taking 2 out of 3 from Texas, they have the Orioles at 99.1% to make the postseason. They don't have to do anything at the trade deadline to make the playoffs at this point. I feel confident in saying that. Yeah, I get it. They haven't played as well over the last month as they played prior to that, but it's not as though they've been in a free fall in the way that you might describe the Yankees a little bit more, and the Yankees having their issues with the Rays over the weekend. But I still, with a highest degree of confidence, even if they do nothing over the next week, they're going to be in the playoffs. So you start at that, right? That's your jumping off point. And you look at then, okay, their odds to win the World Series. And again, this is according to Baseball Reference. I'm just using one example for this exercise. It has them at 11.8% to win the World Series. Now, I would probably say, compared to what you're seeing on sports books and other sites, that's probably on the high side, quite frankly. When you just understand how postseason works, and specifically baseball postseason works, it's probably on the high side. So let's just use 10% as just like a real easy way of looking at this.
They'll have to be this good 10 years in a row to win one time. Wow.
Yeah, sure.
Wow.
I mean, that's where it's tough, right? And look, I've said this about trades, for
not to mention every year that they stunk, it had 0% chance of winning. In the 33 years I've been on the air, they've had a 0% chance of winning the World Series in 28 of those years. Like, literally, they could not win the World Series in most of those years. This is the first time since I've owned this radio station, maybe 14, you could say they can win the World
14.
Series. Okay, fair enough. That's one time in 26 years that you felt like, I have a 1%. Did I have a chance? Did I have a throw? And now you're this good, and you're saying, well, you have to be this good 10 times to win it once. Wow.
I mean, it's
that's
just
math.
But it speaks to how difficult it is. And look, we can go back and look at some of the best trades of the last 30 years, and two come to mind for me. The Astros getting Randy Johnson, and I think back to CC Sabathia going to the Brewers and how incredible he was for that stretch. Neither of those teams even won the World Series, even with those guys being so great. So it still speaks to this not being a proposition where, oh, they traded a bunch of prospects. Oh, they're going to win their World Series now. Like, that's not how it works. Now, that doesn't mean you don't
I
make
forgot
trades.
that Randy Johnson pitched for Houston, by the way. I'm
Yeah,
going to have to look that up.
but he was really good too, right? But they didn't win the World Series that year. For as great as he was, you still are dependent of 9 guys in your lineup, 4 guys in your postseason rotation, at least 4 or 5 stud relievers. Not stud, but really good relievers that you can count on. I talked about this with you recently about the bullpen, and you need a big 4 in your bullpen for the postseason. And who are the Orioles' big 4 right now? I mean, it's a big question there. Without even, we focus so much on the Tarek Skubals and the Garrett Crochets of the world that you look at the bullpen, but it's just, what can you do in terms of making trades that's not going to deplete your farm system, with the understanding, with the reminder that Santander's a free agent after this year. Cedric Mullins and Austin Hayes have 1 more year of club control, and do you really view them as everyday starting players anymore in the outfield with the way they performed? This
What
year.
happens to those guys in club control where they're $10 million players? What does the team do with them in the offseason?
That's why I'm not so quick to want to trade the other young outfielders, because that's where you look at this and say, is Austin Hayes in the final year of arbitration going to be a proper value for what he's giving you now? Same with Cedric Mullins. It doesn't mean I hate those players, but we've definitely seen those players take a step back in terms of being everyday kind of talents. So that's
they've taken a step back in terms of players I want to give money to, let alone put them in the lineup. Just right. I don't want to pay them $10 million. They're not $10 million players.
Right. And it's not your money. And you're saying that. So that's where you look at this and say, okay. And again, they're going to make a couple trades. I'm fully confident in that, but I'll continue to be skeptical that it's going to be these monster additions. First of all, I just don't know if that many monster additions are even out there to make, right? We've talked about Crochet. I've said it to you, and we've heard a little bit of buzz about the Orioles and the Dodgers and Tarek Skubal. To me, he's the big fish as it pertains to starting pitchers that maybe will be out there for the right deal. But are the Tigers going to move him? Are the Tigers going to be reasonable about trying to move him? I don't think Mike Elias is going to trade 3 of his top 5 prospects for him. I think you'll get one of those guys. And the question then is, okay, who are pieces 2, 3, and maybe 4 in that deal? Do they involve some other major league talent swapping? I mean, again, you get into all those issues that there are a lot of moving parts to how this works. And that's why, going back to your point about Rubenstein, not knowing what the payroll flexibility is, not knowing what the vision is from his perspective in terms of telling Mike Elias, hey, we can trade Connor Norby type prospects who are still going to be really attractive, even if they're not like the Orioles elite of elite prospects. They're still really good prospects to other teams. We can trade some guys like that because you're going to be able to spend a little bit more. And that's not to say that, we're not going to spend $300 million a year, but we'll have a much more competitive, higher payroll than we've had over the last 5 years. If you are working from that understanding, Nestor, then yeah, you do have the confidence and the conviction to say, we can move some of these pieces for deals that make sense for us. So I still think it's probably going to be, not probably, they're definitely going to add at least 1 bullpen arm. I've said for probably since spring training, or at least since Tyler Wells was out of the picture and certainly not going to be in the bullpen, that I'd like to see 2 bullpen arms added, because I still don't know who I trust beyond, Craig Kimbrell. Last outing against the Yankees aside, has been really good since mid-May. I've said it a lot. Jacob Webb has probably been the guy I've trusted the most, which is a compliment to him, yes, but also an indictment on, Cano not being quite as good, and CNL Perez having issues. Perez had issues over the weekend in Texas, and just, not having Danny Coulomb out there. So, they've got to add a couple bullpen arms. That's obvious. Rotation. Look, Skubal's the guy that am trying my hardest to get, but I'm still not convinced the Tigers are going to move them. And if they are they expecting Kobe Mayo, Samuel Basayo, and Heston Kjerstad? Are they going to be to that degree where you say, I don't know if Michael Elias will do that. I think he'll trade one of those.
Number one starters are number one starters, right?
Sure. But at the same time, in the same way, to a lesser extent than Garrett Crochet, but Tarek Skubal, go look at his history. He's got some injury history as well. So that doesn't mean you don't do it. That doesn't mean that disqualifies it from happening, if you're the Orioles. But, I guess the prevailing point that I keep trying to come back here to is there is no sure thing. And for everyone who wants the Orioles to go out and get all these pieces, I just don't know if that's going to happen to that degree. And that's where, what is the vision? What is, where is Rubenstein? Where is Mike Elias in terms of what Rubenstein has told him in terms of payroll and what that means? And even if you have carte blanche, even if you have every flexibility, every dollar at your disposal in terms of realistic options that are going to be out there to add an existing contract from a veteran player or two, who exactly is out there that's moving the needle? We talked about this at Fadley's just a couple weeks ago. I went through and looked at a lot of rosters as far as teams that I thought were going to be sellers and trying to project that out. And it's still tricky because you still have some teams that are in that in between right now that over the next week still don't know exactly how they're going to proceed. But there's not a ton of guys out there that necessarily going to move the needle from 10% to suddenly, oh, you've bumped up to 12%. There's no one out there that suddenly the Orioles become a 50-50 proposition to win the World Series. Like, that doesn't exist, right? So that's where you're looking at this in terms of what are you willing to give up? And then what are you actually capable of bringing back that's going to really move the needle? Of course they need another starting pitcher. That's evident. Even though Sunday Dean Kramer gives up a 3-run homer, well, they only scored 2. So yeah, the offense was more the issue on Sunday. But I think everyone sees that Dean Kramer is not the ideal number 3 starter. You could be a Dean Kramer guy and acknowledge that. But again, who's out there that's going to be closer to what Kyle Bradish could be, and not just a marginal upgrade over Dean Kramer? And that's where I look at that and say, I'm not sure that you're going to get, unless you land Skubal, I'm not sure you're going to get that guy that's going to be dramatically better than that. And that's where I've kept coming back to add bullpen. But even on that front, I've heard Mason Miller's name talked about. That's fine. But what exactly is Oakland / Las Vegas / Sacramento going to be willing to accept to part with someone who has a lot of club control left? So, you're not talking about a rental there. So it's a lot right now. But I'll continue to come back to my overall point in terms of where the Orioles are right now. If we're talking about them playing in late October, and we're talking about them in the LCS, we're talking about them going to the World Series for the first time in 41 years, I still will say it's going to be way, way, way more about the guys that they already have. And that's where, keep in mind, that's a good thing. That means they have a really good team already. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this plays out. I still err on the side of tempering expectations because, again,
we're not expecting blockbusters. We're Orioles fans,
really
right?
right. I just think it really is a seller's market. I think
at the end of the week, I'm not expecting Skubal and Crochet and Mason Miller to walk in.
No,
certainly not. That's not happening.
If one of those guys happens, I'm still pretty surprised, just based on, I don't.
It would mean that Elias gave up a lot.
Yeah, but because the White Sox, this is the same team that held on to Dylan Cease at the trade deadline last year, right? And with Crochet, I mentioned Skubal's injury history. At least Skubal's been a starter for multiple years. Crochet, there's just so much unknown. How do you navigate that? I feel Crochet, and I'm not the only one who said this. Lots of people have said this. Crochet, acquiring him, that's almost a move for the future more so than what exactly is his role going to be come September and October, knowing that he's already blown so far past his career innings. And you'll use him and you'll pitch him, but is he going to be a guy that you're just penciling in every 5th day the rest of the year? I don't think so. So there's that, because if you're the whole point is, if you're saying you're all in, that's the kind of talent you're looking for. And look, he's an incredible talent, but how do you navigate that? And what does that mean for the rest of the season for you? And what does that mean in terms of trying to keep him healthy? So, and what are you giving up to give yourself that problem, right? So that's where I've said, if you're going for a big fish, it's Scooble. But I mean, again, I don't know if Detroit's going to be willing to do it. And what are they willing to accept
Well,
as
so much of this to me is about Burns and about like the fact that they're
sure.
not going to sign him and give him money. That if you're going to go giving away real farm pieces, you better get an opening day starter for next year. And maybe Grayson Rodriguez is that guy, but you know what I'm saying? The top of the rotation
Yeah.
guy that
Well,
enters when Burns exits, because you're not going to give Burns $300 million.
right, right. But at the same time, I would say you can't, if you can do that in the process of what happens over the next week, then great. But keep in mind, you also don't pitch games in November, December, January, February, or March, right? Or until the end of March. So
Is
that's
Corbin
always,
Burns a guy you want to see here for 5 years? Is he a guy that you really want to see them give a lot of money
I
to?
mean,
Because so much of this trading deadline, it's the jigsaw
yeah.
puzzle of, yeah, this doesn't have anything to do with Burns. Burns is going to start game one of every, yeah, and then he's going to be gone on Halloween, and you're not going to have him anymore if you get your feelings hurt losing Game 6 of the ALCS, whatever that would be. That this next 10 days is about fortifying the rotation for next year, especially if you're giving away key pieces. The Norbies and the Mayos and not Holiday, but giving away any of the key pieces, you better get a starter for next year's rotation, because I'm
Well,
already looking at that.
well, then you're kind of making an argument against Mike Elias going all in at the deadline. Then I mean, I hear what you're saying, and look, if you can do that and that makes sense, then great. But you can also get your opening day starter on February 1st, like the Orioles did this past year, right? I mean, it's not like these prospects suddenly disappear once the season's over.
Or you deal for Crochet in the offseason,
Right,
like
exactly, and
Dylan, right?
right. I mean, so I hear you on that, and look, I've expressed that sentiment at different times. I mean, if that's something that makes sense, but I don't think you can force that. I think that's where you run into trouble there, where if you're, again, you're trying to thread the needle here in terms of maximizing your chances to win right now, but also understanding that you do have the future. And look, if you're talking in those terms, if you're thinking about your opening day starter and your potential replacement for Corbin Burns, don't work under an artificial deadline, because Corbin Burns will be here through the end of the year, assuming he's healthy, of course. So your deadline for your opening day starter next year is, the end of the off season, right? So I hear that, and of course, if you can land Tarek Skubal, then great, right? I mean, he's got club control. He's got a little bit more of a track record in terms of, as a starter than Crochet, although he's got some injury history as well. Most pitchers do at this point in time. So at this point, it's kind of tough to even try to use that as a deciding factor necessarily all the time. But that's where it's just, it's tough, because again, I go through and I saw a report. John Morosi was talking about the Orioles having some interest in some Reds pitchers, and go look at them. They're league average pitchers. I mean, could that help fortify the next 2.5 months in terms of what they do and the rotation, and adding another piece to the bullpen? Well, sure, but those aren't guys that are moving the needle. So
League average bullpen still better than some of the guys we've had.
See, I don't know about that. I mean, I think they need swing and miss. I'd be more inclined, instead of, but from that standpoint, if you look at the ERA and you look at different guys who, maybe they're striking out 8, maybe 9 guys per 9 innings. I think they need more upside in the bullpen in terms of swing and miss. That's why, we talked about Kopech from the White Sox just a couple weeks ago, and I'm just using him more as an example. But swing and miss stuff. ERA doesn't look good, but that those are the types of arms that I think you're not targeting as your primary targets, as your first choice. But I think philosophically, what the Orioles tried to do with Fuji last year, I think that's something that you're still looking for, because you need guys that swing and miss, right? You need guys that can miss bats. Cano's an example of this, and look, Cano has struck out. His strikeout rate's gone up a touch. At least last I looked at it, a touch from where it was a year ago. But he's still not that guy that is striking people out like Batista, for example. And when you come in the game with inherited runners, which Cano has had issues with, you got to be able to strike some people out, and they just don't have a lot of that in their bullpen right now. So, is there a bullpen arm or two out there that, the more traditional, conventional stats don't look, the ERA might look a little shaky, might be a little higher than you'd like, but you look at the swing and miss and you look at the strikeouts and you say, oh, is there a simple tweak there, or is this a guy that's pitched really well the last 5 or 6 weeks that we can land for a little bit less in terms of prospects, and we think we can cobble together 2 awesome months from that guy? I think that's something that looks attractive. And that's certainly something that's way cheaper than giving up the farm for Mason Miller, for example. So I'm not saying that that's the only thing they'll do, but I think those are the kind of moves that are kind of the under the radar moves, because we've talked about it, Nestor. I mean, bullpen arms are so difficult to predict. And I think especially when you acquire someone in the middle of the season and you change, their pitching coach and the guys that are around them and their workload and the way their manager uses them, I think sometimes you'll get something thinking it's going to be something that's really, really good, and then it doesn't work out so well. And there have been other examples of a guy that maybe doesn't have the best year and maybe isn't looking so hot, statistically speaking, and you go acquire him and you tweak one thing and you say, hey, throw this pitch a little bit more. Why don't you throw that pitch a little more, and that other pitch that's gotten you into trouble, throw that a little bit less? I mean, that's where I think it's always interesting when you make these trades in the middle of the season as opposed to the off season where there's that easy transition time. So, it's another factor. I don't know how this is going to shake out exactly. As I've said over and over, if you're going to ask me whether I'm going to be overwhelmed or underwhelmed, I'm probably going to lean towards the underwhelmed side, because I just think Mike Elias is not going to deal too much in terms of future value to incrementally improve his World Series chances for 2024. But I think there's very clearly some needs here. This is a really good baseball team. I'll continue to say that. And it's still more so about the guys that are already on this roster. But yeah, how can you not look at the rotation and say they need another arm? I mean, just look at this Miami series, Albert Suarez and then TBA, right? I mean, because Povich is down in the minors after being optioned right before the break and wasn't pitching all that well anyway. Who's it going to be? I don't know. Or they have an off day, so are they just going to skip their 5th starter spot for this turn through the rotation? So when you're talking in those terms, then yeah, you need to make a move. So Mike Elias knows that, but the irony is, again, you kind of look at some of the names that are out there, and I don't think they're going to acquire Jack Flaherty again, for example.
Well, that's the cautionary tale. That I was going to bring that up. We can wrap with that because we're going to talk more about this. Luke Jones is here. He's Baltimore Luke. We're getting the Maryland Crab Cake Tour back out on the road. We'll be at State Fair on the 13th of August. I'm also doing a whole bunch of dates with Costas, and we have a new sponsor in Pizza John's. They have a crab cake as well. We're going to have a crab cake tour stop down in Essex in September. So big thanks to everybody down there. Make sure you get over to Pizza John's and take advantage of that ice cream bar. Take advantage of my favorite pizza, which I'm glad to say: pineapple, pepperoni, and ham, imported ham. Make sure you get the import. They import it from outside of Essex at Pizza John's. Luke's going to be around all week. He is out on the front of Baltimore Positive this week. We're revving the engines back up for the trading deadline. The Ravens are back out on the field, Knowings Mills. You'll be hearing a variety of Ravens voices, or it almost sounds like a sports radio station here. Don't tell the people over 105.7, but we're new to business around here. It's only our 33rd year doing this. So we'll be in for a real trading deadline discussion. I'm going around Major League Baseball this week. Luke's going to be out in Knowings Mills this week. The Orioles get home this weekend against San Diego. I am Nestor. We are WNST, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore Positive.